Welcome back, and now we're going to move on in our outline here to discussing the two plays in your Harris-Platzner textbook, Oedipus Tyrannus and Antigone. In your textbook, it's listed as Oedipus Rex, but again, the proper name for it in the Greek is Oedipus Tyrannus, and that is in fact the same play to avoid any confusion. Okay, so I'd like you first to pause your video and turn in your Harris-Platzner textbook to the plays. That's beginning on page 679, and feel free to flip through later pages as you need to while I discuss the two plays. So please pause your video, open in your Harris-Platzner textbook to page 679 to the beginning of Oedipus, here listed as Oedipus Rex. Okay, do you have your textbook open to page 679? Okay, excellent. I'm not going to rehash too much what's in the textbook because I think most of that is pretty clear. I'm just going to give you some additional information from my own perspective, obviously, on these two plays. And again, I'll try to give you some highlights that may help you to choose your character and do your character presentation for Sophocles. So, Oedipus Tyrannus is in fact one of the most impressive Greek tragedies we have, so much so that despite its not receiving first place in its day, it received the attention of the philosopher Aristotle in the following century when he wrote his work Poetics, in which he praised Oedipus Tyrannus as one of the most effective tragedies that he had found. One of the principal reasons for it is that in the theory of Aristotle, the ideal tragedy is one that could be either completed in its plot within a single day, or which would have a chain of events that could be seen as following an intrinsically logical sequence, almost as if it were in fact in one day, even though the plot might make clear that that the action was ongoing over a longer period. So clearly, the action of Oedipus Tyrannus can't possibly have been completed all in one day for obvious reasons, and yet the way that it's presented, it's really hard to recognize that there must have been some passage of time. Like, for instance, the messenger who comes in from Corinth probably did not come immediately after the point when Oedipus asked for the shepherd to come in. In fact, there's quite a bit of plot irregularity and incongruity if you examine very carefully really what's going on here. And that's what's really amazing about this play, is that you don't really stop to think that the plot doesn't make very much sense. Even Oedipus himself, for instance, asked the Thebans, why didn't you investigate the death of the king? Wouldn't that be a really important matter normally? Well, no, they were too distracted with the Sphinx. It seems odd that that's the case. And remember, in the view of an Athenian audience who's really gunning for Thebes as much as possible, it would be quite something to have the Thebans deliberately portrayed as sloppy and careless, even in such important matters as regicide within their city limits, the actual death of their king. So I'm quite sure that there's some slanting against Thebes on that basis. But in addition to that, there's also the sense that realistically, a city probably wouldn't have been that negligent of the slaughter of their king. And again, Oedipus himself inserts a line about that almost as a kind of corrective to the plot, saying, yeah, I get it. I know that this plot really doesn't make very much sense, but just go with me here. Anyway, so I read an article many years ago in Classical Association of New England journal, in which the scholar at that time compared the incongruity of this plot to Star Wars. There's a surprising number of parallels between we're referring now to Episode 4, New Hope, the original Star Wars movie. There are a surprising number of parallels, and I don't want to get off into it too much here, but one obvious point is the incestuous relationship between Oedipus and Jocasta is very close to what almost turns into an incestuous relationship between Luke and Leia, just for starters. But if you watch the plot of both, you can start to realize that the plots don't really intrinsically make very much sense, but just in the total splendor of what's going on with the tragedy and with the movie as originally depicted, it's hard to catch any of those until you stop to think about them later. Probably the incongruities of Star Wars have been made clearer as the later movies have been issued, and especially in the 21st century. But you can still recognize that a really, really great piece of literature or a really great movie might very well captivate the audience so much that it would not be until afterwards, later, that they start to realize, come to think of it, that doesn't really make sense, and so on. All right, anyway, so Oedipus Tyrannus. So what we have here is the depiction of King Oedipus with his star-crossed background about his parents, the fact that he was abandoned because of the oracle that he would kill his father and marry his mother. He gets taken off to Corinth, despite the fact that the shepherd who was charged with actually killing him by Laius and Jocasta was in fact about to do so, but then takes pity on the poor baby and ends up instead saving him and bringing him to Corinth. So he's raised by foster parents there. Then one day he gets challenged by a chum of his in a bar. Do you know that you don't really have the right parentage? And Oedipus goes off to the oracle to find out more about that, and that's when he hears the same oracle that he will kill his father and marry his mother. So he flees Corinth. That's his effort to avoid his fate. Flees Corinth, heads off just randomly up to Thebes, and when he gets to a particular crossroad, he has an unfortunate encounter with a carriage that blocks his way, and when the carriage gets very supercilious with him and refuses to get out of his way, he immediately goes into a massive killing spree, probably one of the most impressive examples in the ancient world of road rage. So he kills everybody except for one shepherd that happens to escape. We will hear more about him later. And among the victims is the passenger in the carriage, who turns out to be the king of Thebes, who unluckily turns out to actually have also been Oedipus's father. When he arrives in Thebes after this awful murder, then he is confronted immediately with the Sphinx, which is the monster that is besetting Thebes for a prior crime. And Oedipus ends up solving the famous riddle of the Sphinx. There are different versions that there were one or two riddles. The first one, the better known one, is what walks on four legs in the morning, 2 legs in the afternoon, and 3 legs in the evening, or different ways of phrasing that. That's mankind because he's a baby, and then he crawls on all fours, and then he stands up and he walks on 2 limbs as a man, and then he ends up with a cane and walks on 3 limbs as an old man. The other one is the one about 2 sisters, one sister consuming the other sister at all times, and yet they stay alive. And again, I'm paraphrasing it, but the correct answer is day and night. So there are the 2 riddles. So the Sphinx ends up dying because the riddles are solved, and Oedipus then becomes king of Thebes and marries the widowed queen, Jocasta, as a reward for getting rid of the Sphinx. Unluckily, of course, Jocasta is actually his mother. Maybe there was a bit of suspicion of the fact that Jocasta is so much older than Oedipus, but somehow, again, stupid Thebans can't figure out anything, as all Athenians know. So, of course, nobody puts 2 and 2 together to realize what's going on. So then another plague befalls the city, and this plague has to do with regicide and parricide. The fact that Oedipus has committed 2 of the most hideous religious offenses one can. Those 2 things: regicide, slaughter of a king; parricide, slaughter of one's father. Not to mention that he's also incestually connected with his mother too, just to put that on top of everything. And so Oedipus, now as king, is charged with trying to resolve the plague. Now, this is key for understanding the resolution of this plot, and that is Oedipus gets into the position of needing to drive the pestilent force out of the city. And so that, in fact, would be the way to purge it in order to get rid of the plague. So he doesn't realize, of course, that he's setting himself up for his own exile, as we come to find out. In the meantime, he consults with the oracle again, and the oracle, brought back by Creon, informs Oedipus that the difficulty is the presence of the murderer of King Laius within the city of Thebes, and that's pollution, what in Greek is called miasma, M-I-A-S-M-A. It's a specific religious pollution that must be removed in order to purge, in this case, the citizens of the city. So Oedipus has got to get that resolved. He then calls for the prophet Tiresias to come and give him additional information. And of course, that leads to the big blow up, where Tiresias doesn't want to reveal the actual truth, but Oedipus presses him on it, and Tiresias ends up, in fact, revealing that that Oedipus is actually the man that he's hunting after. And in time, you get Oedipus denying everything, and Jocasta tries to deny everything, and then Oedipus suddenly realizes from Jocasta that it was at an intersection, and he starts to realize, oops, maybe it really was me. And notice at this point that all Oedipus is concerned about is the possibility that he killed the king Laius. It's not until after a messenger comes from Corinth to inform Oedipus that his foster father died in Corinth, that's Polybus the king, that Oedipus starts to realize from the messenger, who says, oh, by the way, you know perfectly well that wasn't your real father, don't you? What? With all that happening, Oedipus suddenly starts to realize that it isn't just the king Laius that he killed, but he actually killed his father, Laius. So that, in fact, both things actually end up going together. And so Tiresias, of course, the prophet who isn't listened to, is the one who actually ends up telling the truth. And eventually, it turns out that the shepherd who ran away from the murder was also the same shepherd who, in fact, had Oedipus's as a baby body in the first place to kill, and then in fact ended up saving him. So very incongruously, the same person ends up having both roles. And in fact, the messenger who comes from Corinth was also the shepherd who received the baby from the first shepherd. So all of it just sort of fits together in this really vicious jigsaw puzzle, as it turns out. And so as this mystery evolves, Oedipus starts to realize what's going on, and that he can't listen to Jocasta anymore, his wife. And it's when she realizes that he's going to persist in finding out the truth, that's when she flees and hangs herself. And later on, as you see, when Oedipus finds her dead body hanged, he grabs the two brooches off of her dress and stabs himself with them in order to make himself blind. So Oedipus ends up going through a process of attempting to get insight into a mystery, not realizing how deep this particular mystery actually goes. And effectively, Oedipus is actually blind to the consequences of what he's about to do, which is the reason why Tiresias accuses him of being more blind than he himself in trying to pursue this. Oedipus simply does not understand what he's actually getting himself into. And when he finally does actually see it, it is so awful that he, in fact, ends up having to blind himself. It's actually comparable to the very famous philosophical story in Plato's Republic, the one about the cave, where you have people who have been living in a cave for a very long period of time being fooled by these images that are running on a wall. They think that's their reality, and then one day somebody actually gets out of the cave and realizes that there's a big, huge reality outside of that. When he comes back down to try to tell everybody that, he gets killed. And no doubt that blinding light of insight, also the physical light, was probably blinding for him. So insight itself can be blinding when one actually gets it. And that's what Tiresias is foretelling to Oedipus, that he'll be the one who ends up being self-blinded because he cannot cope with the enormous tragic insight that he's come into. What really, of course, makes this tragedy, though, go forward? It's Oedipus himself. What Sophocles does brilliantly here is to show how Oedipus is driven by his own free will impetuously to keep on having to find the truth. First, it's a real mission to save his city, but as he gets obstructed at every step of the way, first by Tiresias and then later by Jocasta, and even in some ways by Creon, Oedipus keeps on persisting on and on, no, I'm going to find this out. And it really turns away from being the state mission of liberating the city from the plague, and more about a personal mission of getting everybody to stop bothering him and to finally assert, see, I'm right and I know better than all of you and you're all wrong. Of course, when Oedipus does all that, he ends up stumbling into the actual truth, and when he finally does realize what's actually happened, then he ends up having to blind himself. The final point to make here is that Oedipus's exile, which means that Oedipus does not end up committing suicide, as you might expect he could, is the way that Oedipus ends up getting driven out into exile, and that's the way of purging the city, as was originally called for at the beginning of the play. Now, what's quite interesting, though, and I'll pause here to go to the next video, is that Oedipus, as it turns out, is not, for some reason, is not actually sent into exile right away, as the end of the play seems to suggest is going to occur. We discover in Oedipus at Colonus that in fact there was a delay in the exile, and then it was later the two sons, Eteocles and Polynices, trying to rule the city together, who take on themselves personally to exile Oedipus because of the curse that now lies upon him. So that ends up being a slip in the plot that causes some family tension that is played out in Oedipus at Colonus after the two brothers end up dead, and Oedipus himself has also died at Athens. That's when we move into the story of Antigone, and that's what we'll now come into in the next video. Okay, so come on right back, and we'll discuss the other play, Antigone.